Hello and welcome to episode 7 of The Center of the Rainbow Circle. Um, One of my goals, whenever I talk about how fiction works, of course, I always talk about how uh, the cliches are nonsense. The writing advice is nonsense. But one of, I think, the most insidious and inaccurate ones is write what you know. And I mentioned that before. Um, and that one bothers me so much. I'm not even sure how it got to be a cliche. It's a terrible bit of advice. It's um, I always call it insidious anti-imaginative propaganda. Um, but I have people defend that one. Um, Last time I actually did this with real human beings. I have a whole audience of cats and dogs right now. But last time I did this for real human beings, I spent an hour and a half talking about this stuff. And one of the few responses was defending write what you know, which is not even a thing that needs any kind of defense because it's non-advice. Um, but I think the uh, target is idealization, and that's sort of where my a couple of episodes ago I talked about action movies. Um, I think it's a very narrow bit of advice that works for a very narrow problem, which is idealization. Uh, so if you have, like a Steven Seagal movie or something like that, um, it the way he takes himself so seriously and he's idealized as this great fighter really cuts any sort of empathy you might have for the character, um, and turns it into unintentionally comedic, that sort of thing. Um, but there's really no good defense, arguably, of write what you know other than that. It's if everybody was just writing what they know and that's all, um, it's a very, very, very limited range of what is even possible. Um, and that's my complaint with a lot of so-called advice. Is a lot of it is designed to be limiting for whatever reason. Um, it eliminates possibility. Whereas if you're trying to help someone become a writer, you open up the possibilities and inspire, you know, the wide range of possibilities of what a story can be. You don't want to limit them to what they know. And most of the time, there are lots of great realist writers who can create great pieces based on what they know. There's great memoirists, but that's a portion of the writers who exist. I would never say that everyone should be a surrealist or a magical realist or a science fiction writer or anything like that just because it's worked for me. But at the same time, I would never say everybody needs to be a realist. And people who have defended write what you know, they're defining the write what you know part of it as broadly as possible in order to make it work. So to go back to the analogy I always go back to, my creative writing education was like I was going to medical school, but they only taught me how to use leeches. Um, it's like the leech here, of course, would be write what you know. It's like you are so enamored with the leeches, you want to make them actually work. Sort of integrating them into actual medicine that actually works. Just let that terrible advice go. Um, but a lot of the problem with it is just the vagueness of the what you know part of it. Um, if you can use it so broadly that it can include imaginative things, then why do you even need to say it to begin with? Um, but anyway, so that connects to what I've been talking about. Um, One fixation that I have is on um, just lately, especially, is comparing popular movies in a particular year to critically acclaimed and award-winning movies, and how do you compare the two to assess get a genuine assessment of what actually a great movie is, or what a great story is at the core of that. Um, and there's so many fascinating anomalies where the taken for granted concept is that the award-winning movies are always better than the popular movies, which is just a really reductive oversimplification. And so you have things like last year was Black Panther versus Green Book. Green Book won the Oscar. Why did it win the Oscar? As compared to Black Panther, which on pretty much every scale really should have been, the best movie by so many different definitions of what best movie, how you can define that. That being said, I caught up on a lot of the, for whatever reason, binged a lot of this type of movie together. A lot of movies about kids with really dramatic and realistic and complicated problems, and a lot of them nominated for Oscars. My favorite one was Eighth Grade, which I'll talk about in a second. Then there was Moonlight and Boyhood. Those have a lot of similarities in subject matter. There was Room, not The Room, but Room. Speaking of good bad movies, I didn't even mention The Room. Subject for a couple of videos ago. But Room, for which Brie Larson won Best Actress. And that might have been it, but those were, I think those were the ones on that subject that I watched all together. Not exactly back to back, but within the span. And Room was my other favorite one. But all of them were, if I were to write what I know, it would probably end up being something like Eighth Grade. That is a subject that I know. But why would we want all movies, I mean, as good as Eighth Grade was, why would we want all movies to be Eighth Grade? But it's a beautiful movie, but why, there are other movies that you can write. But my response to Eighth Grade was that it was the scariest horror movie of the decade. But that was a highly personal response. And that has a lot to do with some basic concepts of storytelling as well, because I do watch lots of horror movies. And I'm desensitized to, things actually presented as horror. A lot of things, because I watch so many, they don't really scare me or affect me necessarily. One of my favorite movies of recent years was a movie called The Void, and it's very graphic. Didn't really find it scary, but it's very enjoyable for the reasons that horror movies are enjoyable, other than being scary. But it's very graphic. So if I had to say, Eighth Grade versus The Void, which one actually scared me? Eighth Grade was much more terrifying, because of the emotional complexity. But Kayla, the main character in Eighth Grade, I think was a very compelling character. Partly because she did this, which was she made these advice videos. And the whole gimmick is clearly she's giving advice that she's not actually living. So, and that's similar to a lot of the things I said about really compelling characters before. The public presentation being this sort of mask guarding the vulnerability. She's a very vulnerable character, very, emotionally intense experiences of social interaction and all that sort of stuff. But she gives advice based not on how she lives, but on how sort of this idealized version of how she thinks that somebody should live, but she's not actually living that way. And that's a very compelling sort of thing. And then by the end, spoiler alert, she's she goes through all these complicated experiences, but then she is still she's still hopeful for the future. Based on the evidence, we don't know if she's really going to have a happy future, but that makes her a compelling character. That despite all of these complex things that she went through, she's still hopeful. So that I'm very anti-write what you know, but there's an example of where write what you know worked very well, arguably. It had some intense emotional responses, maybe not necessarily the ones that the film intended for me. It was much more terrifying than maybe the filmmakers were intending. Bo Burnham. The Room is the other one that I enjoyed. I don't know if that's a relatable experience necessarily. That's the other thing that I think is grossly over exaggerated is relatability based on my own biography. So just look at Kayla. Kayla's a girl, but I found her experience very relatable. Is that why I enjoyed it? Well, no, not really. Just because I've experienced very similar things is not the lone source of my enjoyment of the movie. And so something like The Room, which is, the kid's very imaginative. I do relate to that part of it, but the actual experience of being kidnapped or what have you, and held hostage or what have you, I don't relate to that, but that's ultimately irrelevant. What was the other one? Moonlight, I thought was visually beautiful, but really toothless, and I think that a lot of that has to do with, again, the movies that I enjoy tend to be more graphic, so it reminded me of it's not very similar to it, but it made me think of a movie called Mysterious Skin, which was much more graphic and much more intense. And so, I kept expecting something more graphic and intense to happen. But it was really just pretty and toothless and tame. So much more tame than I thought it would be. But it's not, the character dealing with his sexuality and stuff like that. That particular aspect of it, I didn't really relate to. I like rainbows, but I support transgender wrestlers, but I am straight. But it's ultimately irrelevant. I don't think that's an exaggerated factor in relatability is merely biographical relatability. Having this particular factor being by coincidence a similar biographical factor to my own. It's a fairly exaggerated aspect of. One of my previous videos I talked about Die Hard being one of the greatest movies ever. I have nothing in common with John McClane. I don't advocate gun violence on any level. I don't advocate any level of violence and yet I find John McClane the most compelling and fascinating character in cinematic history. So just having biographical similarities is an incidental coincidental factor, more so than anything else. And then Boyhood, which I appreciated as an experiment, seemed the most false. So it seemed forced in so many different ways. It was my least favorite of all of them. But it was, the whole experiment of doing it over 12 years was fascinating and compelling. I like experimental things. But the experiment was at the surface of just kind of a lame story. It was writing what you know. And I think if you really took the write what you know advice, as seriously as it seems to be desiring to be taken. I've Write What You Know has become this this monstrous entity, trying to suck up all the imagination and digest it, and destroy it. But if you were to take that as at face value, and actually write what you know, it would come off a lot more similar to Boyhood, just rambling and no real interesting, compelling character development. I mean, the Patricia Arquette character had some interesting development, but it was so scattershot that it was hard to really attach to any of the characters. And that's, if we're talking about writing what you know, that's writing what you know. What you know is random events, characters who do random things for no reason, and all of these different scenes are disconnected. That's writing what you know. Whereas, if you compare that to eighth grade, there was a shape to it that made it more compelling. It wasn't random, although there were a lot of events that were realistic. The attachment that you had to the Kayla character based on, for example, the disconnect between the advice that she's giving in videos versus how she actually lives. The hope for her to, overcome a particular set of focused problems. So, Mason from Boyhood had problems, but there was really no shape to them. There were so many different problems. There were so many different, little moments that didn't really add together to make really an interesting narrative. And a lot of this is personal. I know Boyhood was one of the most beloved movies of all time when it came out. But, highly subjective. But if my main point is, if we took Write What You Know seriously, every movie that came out would be Boyhood, 8th grade, Moonlight, Boyhood, 8th grade, Moonlight, Boyhood, 8th grade, Moonlight, or at different ages, or what have you. And that is not a world I want to live in, Bo. That is not that is an underwhelming, underutilized world of so many possibilities that we're really narrowing it down to such a very, very narrow span of what is actually possible. So to take so-called advice and to treat it as a universal is irresponsible, really. So don't tell writers write what you know. It's a terrible piece of advice. If they have an interesting story to tell, if their desire is to be a memoirist or something like that, fantastic. That very particular writer should write what they know. Writers with an imagination who are doing kind of flat, idealized characters, Steven Seagal action stars, what have you, in this, imaginative story. Write what you know is harmful advice. Don't idealize your characters. Give your characters, a bit of texture. That would be the same advice, if somebody writes the story for 8th grade. And if Kayla was purely a victim and, never did anything about her victimhood, if she never took any sort of action to overcome her problems or what have you, that's as flat as having a flat in one note, just pure misery. If she was just going through pure misery, that's as one note as just having Steven Seagal punching people, and having just one particular emotion over and over again, if it's misery or if it's anger, if it's action, if it's explosions or what have you. Having one particular emotion just repeated over and over again without any sort of development, that burns out the viewer, so that the viewer's no longer able to really feel it. Sort of like with me with horror movies. I'm burned out on them to a significant degree that I'm no longer able to really, experience them fully. And that's true, if you have a highly realistic character who's, experiencing nothing but misery, then that, short circuits the audience's ability to feel that. That's much better advice than just saying, your character's unrealistic, and realism being essentially an irrelevant factor. But your character's unrealistic. You should write what you know, and therefore improve the character by making the character realistic. That's such a limited, restrictive sort of advice. But people still disseminate them. I should write 8th grade, starring Bo. Hi, I'm Bo. I'm a Kit Kat in 8th grade. But anyway, I'm getting ridiculous now. Make sure to smash that subscribe button. Smash that like button. Like, share, and subscribe. Tell all your friends about my great advice. Talk to you later.